Let's move on. This is a really important story, something that we always want to try and highlight here. Marco Rubio and Sherrod Brown, so Republican from Florida and then Democrat from Ohio, sent a joint letter to Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, let's put that up there on the screen, calling for an immediate investigation of Amazon's labor practices. And, you know, this is something where, look, there's a lot of rhetoric around right, left, can they work together, etc. In many cases, the answer is no, and there's irreconcilable differences. But we do want to try and highlight any sort of bipartisan push in order to benefit organized labor, or not even just organized labor, just labor generally. And that actually, I found in this letter a little bit of a glimmer of hope, because what we saw here, Krystal, is that Rubio and Sherrod Brown, they write about, we write to urge you, and this is to the Labor Secretary, to investigate Amazon Inc.'s labor practices. You oversee an investigative enforcement authorities, and we ask you to ensure these authorities that Amazon is treating its workers fairly, with dignity, in accordance with the law. And then they list out, in December 2020, the NLRB upheld claims Amazon had wrongfully terminated an employee protesting working conditions. In February, March 2021, NLRB conducted a mail ballot election around what we were talking about in Bessemer, Alabama. So Rubio here is specifically citing with the NLRB finding that Amazon did tamper with the union election, which will lead to another one. 2021, April, violating labor laws, firing 2 workers who criticize employee practices. There's a litany of other complaints there within. I think what's important, though, is that these both focus on unions, organized labor, the conditions of the workers themselves, and it's signed by a Republican senator. And look, the bar can be low, but that is important in terms of its salience for when a labor secretary himself will be like, wow, maybe I'll get some bipartisan street cred by doing something about this. It sends a message to Biden, but the most important, it sends a message to Amazon.
You know, it's really interesting because when Rubio came out in favor of the union election in Bessemer.
That's right. It's like 7 months
we
ago.
gave him some credit for doing it.
Yes,
But
correct.
his op-ed about it was extremely cringe.
Yeah, it was cringe.
It was like, in general, I don't think that unions are good.
It was like, unions are bad, the PRO Act is bad, organized labor is bad, but I hate Amazon because they're woke, so.
Right, but woke HR department, so I'm in favor in this one very limited instance of the union. This looks like genuine.
Yeah, this is real stuff.
Growth.
Right.
And I wonder, I mean, listen, it's too much to really hope, but I wonder if he heard some of that criticism and feedback and ultimately took it in, because this does seem like, you know, a growth trajectory, which I am delighted to see. And I read carefully through this letter that they sent, looking and waiting for the cringe, and it's not there.
It's not there.
Every single thing that they itemize are things we've covered on this show.
Yes,
I think
almost
we've covered
every single element.
I think we've covered all of them on the show. In fact, they talk like Chris Smalls, they talk about the union election, they talk about what happened with the tornadoes in Kentucky, all of those things. So that is genuinely significant. And there's a couple other things that I'll say about this. I mean, listen, Rubio now effectively has the lane of this type of potentially pro-labor politics to himself, because frankly, people on the Democratic Party are not going to want to work with Josh Hawley after his whole, you know,
After
insurrectionist, the fist, like he's made himself so toxic that any leadership that he could have potentially had in these types of areas is off the table. Now, I also want to say Josh Hawley's been bad on unions. Like, he supported right to work in Missouri, and he has not had a good track record there. So I'm not saying he would have been interested in doing this anyway. But if he ever was interested in doing this sort of like, you know, horseshoe economic politics with people like Bernie again, like he did before with the checks.
With the checks.
It's going to be a lot more difficult.
I have tried to point this out. I'm like, look, you make yourself politically toxic whenever you embrace this nonsense, and you actually make it so that any bipartisan ability to get anything done is less. That being said, I don't think that a lot of them care, because they want to be president and they want juice with the Republican base. So look, we'll see.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. You made your choice. But the other instances where we also wanted to highlight this is from a congressional candidate named Joe Kent in Washington. He's been making some waves. I heard a little bit about him here in D.C. Let's put it up there in the screen. He actually quote tweeted Bernie Sanders talking about Kellogg's workers who were being replaced because they were on strike. He says, quote, Bernie is right. We must protect U.S. workers from having their jobs taken from them. If Kellogg's wants to make cereal in Mexico, they shouldn't get to sell it in America. We must strive to be a nation that cares about our people, not just an economy. I mean, look, you would be hard-pressed to find a Republican candidate who is running against a person who voted for Trump's impeachment, who is then endorsing a labor message and strike message from Bernie Sanders to Kellogg workers. I'm not saying this is the mainstream of the Republican Party. Joe Kent is very much in the minority in talking about this, but it's significant because he does have his cultural base covered because he's pro Stop the Steal, basically.
Right, and Trump endorsed him.
And Trump endorsed him, key, because he's running against somebody who voted for his impeachment. And it's interesting to me because it's like you can sneak in a lot of stuff if you're willing to play the culture war on the other flank. As we pointed out, though, with Hawley, it can also make it so that it cancels any ability to actually do anything about it.
Because ultimately the culture war is the center, the culture war controls.
Right.
And so if you can occasionally sneak in one or two heterodox economic positions, that's all well and good. But those are the first things to drop.
Yes.
The culture war is the thing that will
and I would say this is
that will always be there.
This is ubiquitous. J.D. Vance, another one, full disclosure, a personal friend of mine. So take that also with a grain of salt. Put that up there on the screen saying, quote, allowing companies to use overseas slaves to undercut the wages of American workers is a political decision. We can make differences and protect the livelihoods of our people. He was quote tweeting there the quote tweet of Bernie. But again, tacitly endorsing the message, not necessarily of unions, but of standing as Bernie was with the Kellogg workers themselves who are protesting outsourcing both of their jobs and the full replacement of them because they had the audacity to strike for better wages. Am I saying that some great right-left alliance will come? No. But these are significant developments in the field of labor politics, and I just want to see people get help and people done. So, you know, you can welcome it to a certain extent and be realistic about what it represents.
They're a major divergence from the lockstep uniformity of the National Republican Party since the Reagan era.
That's right.
I mean, that's what it is there little teeny sparks and glimmers of something different. And that is, I mean, that is extraordinary because the Republican Party has been just totally unified on a union-busting approach.
And right to work,
especially. For decades now. Right to work was a major, hugely, well-financed.
You know, let me just say this story, which is that I personally know that voters don't give a damn either way. It was purely Koch funded.
Yes.
These abilities, top down from the billionaires, from the donors, straight to the candidates saying right to work is our top priority. So they shove it into the legislature and actually make sure that
and that's how you end up, I mean, backing Scott Walker and all those fights, that were happening during the Obama years. But yeah, that was an extraordinarily organized, concerted, well-financed effort to push right to work across the country. The idea for the Kochs was very ideological. It was also about political power because labor unions, would fund and support Democratic causes. And so the Democrats, stupidly, not understanding power, decided to abandon the labor unions by and large. I mean, you had plenty of Democrats who decided they would jump on the bandwagon with right to work, people like Mark Warner and others who thought that was the way of the future. And they wanted to align themselves instead with the sort of white-collar professional class. Really stupid decision on the Democrats' part, very smart political power decision on the Republican part, because they saw, okay, this is where a bulk of the money is coming for Democratic politicians, so we're gonna try to kill this whole movement off. So that's why, even though these are really small signs, they do represent something really different. I also have to say, take the time to watch that Bernie Kellogg's video.
Oh, it's a great video.
Because it's really good. They did a really good job. One of the things he says, which I think is part of why, his rhetoric was very well calibrated. He's one of the only people on the left, elected politicians, who knows how to do this well. He says in this thing, if you love America, you love the workers. And if you love American workers, you don't ship their jobs to desperate people in Mexico and pay them 90 cents an hour. I mean,
you'd be hard-pressed to find a single person in this country who disagrees, who isn't worth $10
That's a great
million.
message. Okay, Democrats, leftists, take that sort of language and messaging that connects with, like you said, you get 80% agreement on that.
90%.
Lean into that. Right. And that's why Bernie came as close and did as well as he did, is because he almost uniquely knows how to message in that way. So the last thing I'll say on this is, even though at the national level, Republicans have been lockstep anti-labor, that hasn't been true at the local level, especially in states like West Virginia and Kentucky. You have some Republicans who continued to be labor Republicans and continue to support things like, union rights and to push back against some of the ways that labor power was cut back in states, and especially in some of these sort of like populist Appalachian states. So it's not crazy to think that you could have some contingent of the Republican Party nationally that is also at least somewhat supportive of labor rights. And it matters if you do, because it makes labor unions more powerful.
Yes.
Because right now, since it's only Democrats that support them, it makes it very easy to caricature them as just like another tool of the hated Democratic Party. So if you have some bipartisan support, suddenly they become a much more relevant and potent cultural powerhouse. You can see this in a state like West Virginia. This is something we forgot to mention about Manchin, where the coal miners, because they have such cultural cachet and because they have political cred between Democrats and Republicans, they have a lot of influence.
They run the table, right?
They still have a lot of influence in the state. And oh, by the way, the thing I forgot to mention with the Build Back Better fallout is they have come out against Manchin's position on Build Back Better. Why? Because there was money in Build Back Better to support coal miners who are stricken with black lung.
Right.
So just an interesting example of how bipartisanship within the labor movement is actually really important for strengthening the labor
100%.
movement.
Yeah, and we're going to try and highlight any example of that we can find. So if you see one, please send
Let us know. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.